The air in the crematorium was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and the even thicker scent of manufactured grief. I was standing in the receiving line, my hand numb from being shaken, my face aching from a smile that didn't belong there. My mother was clinging to my arm, her sobs conveniently timed for when a new sympathizer approached. It was all a performance, and I was the unwilling stage manager. Then, a woman I'd never seen before stepped in front of me. She was older, with eyes that held no platitudes, only a weary sharpness. She ignored my mother completely. "I'm sorry for the man you thought you lost," she whispered, her voice a low, urgent hum. Before I could process the strange phrasing, she pressed a small, cold, old-fashioned brass key into my palm, closing my fingers around it. "He wasn't who you thought he was," she said, her gaze unwavering. "This will prove it." And then she was gone, melting back into the crowd of black suits and veiled pleasantries, leaving me with a key in my hand and a chasm opening in my life. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. My fiancé, Ben, saw the whole exchange. I felt his hand on the small of my back, a silent anchor in the swirling tide of my family's drama. He leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear. "Are you okay? Who was that?" I could only shake my head, my fingers tightening around the key until its teeth dug into my skin. The metal was a tiny, solid piece of reality in a day that felt like a poorly written play. My mother, of course, had seen nothing. She was too busy accepting condolences from a distant cousin, her face a perfect mask of tragic bereavement. She was a master of appearances, a skill my father had both admired and exploited. Later, as we sat in the sterile, quiet limousine, the key felt like it was burning a hole in my purse. My brother, Leo, was on his phone, already talking to someone from his office about a deal. "The market doesn't stop for death, Mia," he'd said with a shrug when I shot him a look. That was Leo, practical to the point of being a sociopath. My mother was fussing with a loose thread on her dress. "I do hope the caterers remembered no nuts in the pesto," she murmured, as if that were the most pressing concern. My father was gone, and they were worried about stock prices and canapes. I said nothing. I had been saying nothing for 28 years. I was the family's shock absorber, the designated peacemaker, the one who quietly paid the bill when someone's credit card was declined, the one who listened to the circular arguments and endless complaints without ever offering my own. My role was to be the stable, responsible one, so they could all continue their regularly scheduled programming of dysfunction. Dad had always called me his little rock. It wasn't until I met Ben that I realized being a rock just means you're easy to stand on. Ben had a way of seeing through the fog. "It's not normal, Mia," he'd say gently after a holiday dinner where I was expected to cook, clean, and mediate a fight between my father and Leo over a football game. "The way they talk to you, the things they expect. It's not about love, it's about utility." I'd always brushed it off. That's just how they are. It's easier not to fight. But holding that key, I started to wonder what other truths I had avoided, because fighting for them seemed too hard. The reception at my parents' house was exactly what you'd expect. A sea of hushed whispers, my father's business associates drinking his expensive scotch, and my mother flitting between groups, telling a sanitized, heroic version of my father's final days. Leo was schmoozing, of course, shaking hands and accepting, "I'm sorry for your loss," with the same gravity he used when accepting a business award. I found a corner in the kitchen, needing to escape the oppressive weight of it all. Ben found me there, handing me a glass of water. "Talk to me," he said. I opened my palm and showed him the key. It was ornate, the kind you see for old diaries or jewelry boxes. It was definitely not a key to a door. "She said he wasn't who I thought he was," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "She said this would prove it." Ben turned the key over in his fingers. "Your mum and Leo will say she's a crank," he said, already predicting their moves. "They'll tell you to throw it away, to not desecrate his memory." He was right, that was their playbook. Anything that challenged their carefully constructed reality was to be dismissed as crazy, malicious, or a misunderstanding. To understand my family, you have to understand the dynamic. My father, Richard, was the son. Everything revolved around him. He was a successful financial advisor, or so we were told, a man who projected an aura of absolute competence and control. He was generous in public, but in private, his generosity was a weapon. It always came with strings. Leo was the golden child, the heir apparent. He was a carbon copy of my father in ambition, but lacked the charm, replacing it with a blunt arrogance. He could do no wrong. If he wrecked a car, Dad bought him a new one. If he failed a class, Dad called the dean. I, on the other hand, was the utility infielder. I was the good one, the responsible one. When I got a scholarship to college, my father told everyone it was because of the excellent foundation he'd provided. When I graduated with honours, he joked that I must have gotten my mother's brains, a backhanded compliment that managed to insult us both. I was the one who was expected to lend Leo money for his startups, money I never saw again. I was the one who had to leave work early to take my mother to a doctor's appointment, because Dad was in a very important meeting. My life was a series of small sacrifices made at the altar of their convenience, all under the guise of being a good daughter and a good sister. It was a quiet, insidious form of erosion, and I hadn't even realized how much of myself had been worn away. The day after the funeral, the performance was over, and the raw, unfiltered version of my family emerged. We were gathered in my father's study, a room panelled in dark wood and smelling of leather and his cologne. It was a monument to his ego, lined with awards and photos of him with various local dignitaries. My mother sat behind his enormous desk, looking small and lost. Leo paced in front of the window, already impatient. "Okay," he said, clapping his hands together. "The lawyer is coming tomorrow to do the official reading of the will, but Dad told me the basics. The house goes to Mom, of course. The portfolio is split between us, and Mia gets the contents of the safe and her trust." He said it so casually, as if dividing a person's life was as simple as slicing a pie. My mother nodded. "That's right. Richard was always so organized." I felt a familiar pang of something. Not jealousy, but a kind of weary resignation. The portfolio was worth millions. The contents of the safe were probably some sentimental photo albums and my grandmother's pearls, which he'd promised me years ago. And her trust was a fund my maternal grandfather had set up for me, which my father managed. He'd always used it as a carrot and a stick. "If you're smart with your money, Mia, I'll let you have full control of the trust when you're 30, he'd say, a veiled threat that if I ever stepped out of line, he'd hold it over my head. I was 28. The conversation was exactly as I expected, until I decided to deviate from the script. "A woman came up to me at the funeral yesterday," I began, my voice steady. Leo stopped pacing. My mother's head snapped up. "She said something strange. She gave me this." I placed the small brass key on the polished surface of the desk. It looked tiny and absurd against the massive piece of furniture. Leo scoffed, picking it up and examining it with disdain. "What is this? Looks like something out of a flea market." "She said Dad wasn't who we thought he was," I continued, watching their faces. She said this was the proof. The reaction was instantaneous and perfectly coordinated, like they'd rehearsed it. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Mia, how could you? On this day of all days. Your father has just passed, and you're bringing up nonsense from some vulture." Leo tossed the key back on the desk. Ben was right, I thought. She's a crank. He jabbed a finger in my direction. Dad had a public profile. People get weird. Crazies come out of the woodwork. You need to be smarter than this. You're being disrespectful to his memory. It was classic. The two-pronged attack. Emotional manipulation from Mom, dismissive aggression from Leo. Shift the blame. Make me the bad guy for even asking the question. In the past, this would have been enough. I would have apologized, mumbled something about being tired and emotional, and put the key away, ashamed of myself for disrupting the peace. But something had shifted in me. Maybe it was the cold finality of the funeral, or the stranger's piercing gaze, or just 28 years of suppressed frustration finally reaching its boiling point. I picked up the key. "Maybe," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. Or maybe she was telling the truth. The week that followed was a masterclass in gaslighting. My mother would call me multiple times a day, her voice thick with sorrow, to remind me of what a wonderful man my father was. She'd recount stories of his generosity, his community spirit, his unwavering love for his family. Every story was a subtle jab, a reminder that my questioning his perfection was a betrayal. Remember that time he flew all the way to your college just to bring you your favorite soup when you had the flu, darling? Not many fathers would do that. I remembered. I also remembered that he'd stayed for 20 minutes, taken a picture of the moment for his social media, and then left me to fly to a golf weekend in Florida, leaving the rental car for me to return to the airport an hour away. The details always got lost in the official family mythology. Leo, on the other hand, took a different approach. He was all condescending pragmatism. "Mia, you need to focus on what's important," he'd say over the phone. "We have to deal with the estate. We have to support Mom. This fantasy you're chasing about some secret key is a distraction. It's morbid." He used the word morbid a lot. He also used unstable and grief-stricken, suggesting that my curiosity was a symptom of mental distress. He even suggested I see a therapist, not to help me process my father's death, but to help me get a grip on reality. The pressure was immense. It was a coordinated campaign to make me doubt my own sanity. They were trying to herd me back into my designated box, the one labeled compliant daughter. Anytime I tried to find a rational starting point for the key, I hit a wall. I searched my father's study, his closets, his old boxes in the attic. Nothing. The key fit no lock I could find. It was for something small, something personal. I started to think about what the woman had said. "I'm sorry for the man you thought you lost." It implied a public self and a private one. My father was obsessed with his public image. He curated it like a museum exhibit, but the man I knew in private was different. He wasn't overtly cruel, but he was a master of the subtle emotional manipulation. Everything was transactional. "I paid for your education, so the least you can do is spend Christmas here. I co-signed on your apartment, so don't make any big decisions without talking to me first." It was a web of obligation, spun so skillfully that I never saw the spider. Ben was my only lifeline to sanity. "They're scared, Mia," he said one night as I sat staring at the key on our coffee table. "People who have nothing to hide don't work this hard to stop someone from looking." He was right. Their panic was the biggest clue of all. If the woman was just a random crank, why were they so desperate for me to drop it? Their frantic efforts to shut me down only strengthened my resolve. The key wasn't just a key anymore. It was a symbol of every question I'd never been allowed to ask, every doubt I'd been forced to swallow. And I was going to find the lock it opened, no matter what they said. The search for the lock became an obsession. I knew it wasn't in the house. I had exhausted every possibility. The key was too old-fashioned for a modern safe or piece of furniture. It had to be for something off-site. My first thought was a safety deposit box. The day after the lawyers' meeting, where the will was read just as Leo had predicted, I took the key to every bank in my father's town. I felt ridiculous, sliding the brass key across the counter to a series of polite but confused bank tellers. "Do you recognize this type of key? Could it be for a box here?" The answer was always a sympathetic but firm no. Most banks hadn't used keys like this in decades. After the fifth bank, I sat in my car feeling defeated. Leo called while I was sitting there. "Mom said you were asking around at the banks," he said, his tone dripping with disappointment. "Mia, this is getting embarrassing. People talk. You're making it look like Dad had something to hide." The town grapevine was in full effect. Of course, my mother had a friend who worked at one of the banks. They were closing ranks, monitoring my every move. "Maybe he did have something to hide, Leo," I snapped, my patience gone. "Did you ever think of that?" There was a pause. "You sound just like her," he said, his voice cold. "Like who?" I asked. "Just drop it, Mia. For Mom's sake." He hung up. His words rattled me. "You sound just like her." Who was her? It was a slip, a crack in the carefully maintained facade. He knew something. He had to. I drove home, his words echoing in my head. That night, Ben and I were brainstorming. "If not a bank, then what?" he mused, holding the key up to the light. "It's not a post office box. Maybe a private vault service?" We looked a few up, but they were all hyper-modern, using key cards and biometric scans. This key was analog. It was old world. "What about a storage unit?" I suggested. "But it's so small. You don't get a key like this for a big roll-up door." "No. But what if it's for a box inside a storage unit? Ben countered. Like a locker or a trunk. It was a possibility. The problem was, there were dozens of storage facilities in a 20-mile radius. It would take weeks to check them all, and I doubted they'd let me wander around trying a key in random locks. I was about to give up for the night when my eyes landed on a box of my dad's old things that my mum had insisted I take. It was full of his college yearbooks and photo albums. I'd glanced through them before, but this time I looked more closely. Tucked in the back of a 1975 yearbook, I found a small, faded photograph. It was of my father, looking young and happy, with his arm around a woman I didn't recognize. On the back, in his familiar scrawl, it said, "Me, Eleanor. Lakeview, 74. Below that, in different, more feminine handwriting, were the words, "The start of everything." I had never heard the name Eleanor in my life. The name Eleanor felt like a detonation in the silent room. My mother's name is Carol. They met in 1979, or so the official family story went. Who was Eleanor? I stared at the photograph. She was beautiful, with long, dark hair and a bright, uninhibited smile. She was looking at my father with such open adoration, and he was looking back at her the same way. It was a picture of two people deeply in love. It was a look I had never once seen him give my mother. I immediately went online, my heart pounding. I searched for Richard Miller and Eleanor, adding Lakeview to the search terms. The internet is a frighteningly effective archaeologist. It took less than 10 minutes to find it, a digitized newspaper archive from the Lakeview local paper, a wedding announcement from June 1975. Eleanor Jensen weds Richard Miller. I felt the air leave my lungs. My father had been married before. He had a whole other life, a whole wife that he had completely and utterly erased. It was a lie of such breathtaking magnitude that I couldn't process it at first. My entire life, my entire understanding of my family's history, was built on a foundation of sand. Leo's words from the phone call came crashing back. "You sound just like her." He wasn't talking about my mother. He was talking about Eleanor. He knew. He had to have known. My mother? Did she know? Had she been a willing participant in this lie, or was she a victim of it too? I suddenly felt sick. The carefully constructed image of my father as a pillar of integrity, a man of his word, shattered into a million pieces. He wasn't just a manipulative father. He was a liar on a scale I couldn't comprehend. Ben sat beside me, reading the screen over my shoulder. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just put his arm around me. "What else did he lie about?" he asked softly. That was the question, wasn't it? This was clearly bigger than a simple, youthful first marriage that ended. People get divorced. They don't typically expunge their ex-spouse from existence. There had to be more to the story. And the woman at the funeral, who was she? Was she Eleanor? No, the woman in the picture was too young. A sister, maybe? A daughter? My mind was racing, connecting dots I never knew existed. The key, the woman, Eleanor, Leo's slip-up, my family's panic. It was all part of the same secret, a secret they were guarding with their lives. My search was no longer about a mysterious key. It was about uncovering the truth of who my father really was, and in doing so, uncovering the truth of who I was, the responsible daughter of a great man, or the child of a con artist raised in a house of lies. The next step was clear. I had to find out what happened to Eleanor Jensen. My investigation into Eleanor Jensen began with public records, a sterile and detached way to uncover a deeply personal story. I found a divorce certificate dated 1978, just 3 years after the wedding. The grounds were cited as irreconcilable differences, a bland term for what must have been a world of pain. A year later, according to the documents, he married my mother. The timeline was tight, uncomfortably so. It painted a picture of a man who moved on with ruthless efficiency. The real breakthrough came when I found a digitized article from that same Lakeview newspaper, dated 1978, a few months before the divorce was finalized. The headline was small, buried in the local news section. Local business suffers devastating fire. The business was Jensen's Fine Woods, a family-owned custom furniture shop. The owner was listed as Thomas Jensen, Eleanor's father. The article described the fire as a total loss, noting that the insurance coverage had mysteriously lapsed just a month prior. The cause of the fire was officially ruled as undetermined, but arson was suspected. No one was ever charged. My blood ran cold. My father, a financial advisor, would have known all about insurance policies. He was married to the owner's daughter. Could he have been involved? It seemed monstrous, something out of a crime novel. But after discovering his secret first marriage, the realm of what was possible had expanded dramatically. I needed to find someone who knew Eleanor, someone who was there. The wedding announcement listed Eleanor's maid of honor, her sister, Catherine Jensen. A quick search for Catherine Jensen from Lakeview yielded a few possibilities. I took a gamble and started making calls. The first two were dead ends. The third woman who answered had a voice that was cautious, weary. "Yes, this is Catherine," she said. "Who is this?" I took a deep breath. "My name is Mia Miller. My father was Richard Miller. I think he was once married to your sister, Eleanor." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing. I thought she had hung up. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was filled with a lifetime of anger. "It took you long enough," she said. It was her, the woman from the funeral. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. The woman who handed me the key was my father's first sister-in-law. She wasn't a crank or a gold digger. She was a witness. "Can we meet?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I have so many questions." "I'll do you one better," Catherine said. "I'll show you. Do you still have the key?" "Yes," I said. "I have it." "Good," she replied. "Because Richard was a thief in every sense of the word. He didn't just steal my family's money, he stole our story. It's time you knew the truth." She gave me an address. It wasn't a house or an office. It was a storage facility, an old one, on the industrial outskirts of town, the kind that still used padlocks and brass keys. The storage facility was a bleak landscape of corrugated steel and faded paint. Rust stains bled down the sides of the roll-up doors like old wounds. It looked like a place where things went to be forgotten. Catherine Jensen was waiting for me by the keypad at the entrance. She looked different than she had at the funeral, less guarded, but no less intense. The weary sharpness in her eyes was still there. She was dressed simply, in jeans and a jacket, and she nodded at me as I got out of my car. "Mia," she said. It wasn't a question. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice sounding small in the open, windy space. "Thank you for trusting me." "I'm not trusting you," she corrected, her tone blunt but not unkind. "I'm trusting that Richard Miller's daughter might have inherited a conscience, even if he never had one. Let's go." She led me down a long, echoing corridor to a unit at the very back. It was smaller than the others, with a simple hinged door, instead of a roll-up one, secured by an old, heavy-duty padlock. "This was my sister's," she said, gesturing to the lock. "After everything fell apart, she put a few things in here, things she couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't bear to throw away. When she died, the facility manager contacted me. I've been paying the bill on it for 15 years, waiting for the right time." "Eleanor is dead?" The news hit me harder than I expected. I had been picturing a woman out there somewhere, a woman I could maybe meet. "Cancer," Catherine said, her voice softening for the first time. "It took her 5 years ago. She never remarried. She never really recovered from what he did to her." She looked at me. "Go on, the key." My hand was trembling as I inserted the brass key into the padlock. It was stiff at first, but with a bit of force, it turned with a loud, grating click. The lock sprang open. I pulled it off and, with Catherine's help, tugged the heavy door open. The air that billowed out was stale and musty, the smell of sealed-up time. The unit was tiny, no bigger than a walk-in closet. It wasn't filled with furniture or large boxes. Instead, there were 3 large, leather-bound document cases, a sealed cardboard box, and a single, beautiful wooden chest with intricate carvings. It was a time capsule of a life I never knew existed. "He told her he'd put all their important documents in a safety deposit box," Catherine said, her voice low and bitter. "Wedding certificate, property deeds for the shop, insurance policies. After the fire, when my father was ruined and Ellie was destroyed, she found out he'd let the policy on the shop lapse. He claimed it was an oversight, a terrible mistake. He was so convincing. He bankrupted my father, and he did it while playing the part of the grieving, supportive son-in-law. She pointed at the document cases. Ellie was smart, though. Before he left her, she got suspicious. He was always so secretive with his mail. One day, she went to the post office and opened a box in her own name. She started having copies of their financial statements sent there. She didn't know what she was looking for, but her gut told her something was wrong. What she found, well, that's in there. That's the man you never knew. My hands shook as I reached for the first leather document case. It was heavy, filled with papers that felt fragile with age. Catherine and I carried the cases and the wooden chest out of the storage unit and loaded them into my car. We didn't speak. The weight of what we were about to uncover hung between us, too heavy for words. I drove us to a quiet coffee shop, needing a neutral space, a place with light and the murmur of other people's normal lives to counteract the darkness I was stepping into. We sat at a corner table, and I unbuckled the strap on the first case. The documents inside were meticulously organized, labeled in Eleanor's neat cursive. The first set of folders contained bank statements from a joint account she held with my father. I saw his salary deposits, their mortgage payments, the mundane finances of a young married couple. But then, I saw the withdrawals. Large, regular cash withdrawals, thousands of dollars at a time, with no corresponding deposits into any other known account. It was a steady, systematic drain. The next folder was even more damning. It contained duplicates of loan applications. My father had been taking out high-interest personal loans from less than reputable lenders, all in his name, but using the furniture shop, Jensen's Fine Woods, as collateral. He had forged her father's signature on the documents. The sheer audacity of it was stunning. He was leveraging her family's legacy, their life's work, without their knowledge, and siphoning off the cash. Catherine watched my face as I read. My father trusted him completely, she said, her voice tight. Richard was the smart one, the one with the head for numbers. He told my dad he was restructuring the business finances to make it more profitable. What he was really doing was bleeding it dry. I flipped to the next section. It was correspondence from the insurance company. A letter confirming my father's request to cancel the fire and casualty policy on the shop, dated exactly 1 month before the fire. The reason he gave was that he was switching to a more comprehensive provider. He never did. He just cancelled it. The official report called the fire's cause undetermined. Looking at that letter, it was crystal clear. It may as well have been a signed confession. He hadn't just let the policy lapse. He had cancelled it intentionally. He had set the stage for the destruction of their business, knowing they would have no recourse. He waited for it to burn, collected on the loans he'd taken out against it, and then walked away, leaving them with nothing but ashes and debt. He had destroyed them, completely and methodically. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't bad luck. It was a plan, a cold, calculated, evil plan. I felt a wave of nausea. This was the man my mother lionized, the man my brother emulated. This was the hero whose memory I was supposed to protect. The second document case was about what came next. It detailed the aftermath. There were letters from lawyers, collection agencies, and the bank, all addressed to Eleanor and her father. They were being pursued for the debts my father had secretly incurred. They lost their home. Thomas Jensen, a proud man who had built his business from the ground up, suffered a massive heart attack 6 months after the fire. He survived, but he was never the same. He died 2 years later, a broken and bankrupt man. Catherine explained it all in a low, steady voice, the pain still fresh even after all these years. Richard played the victim right alongside Ellie, she said, stirring her untouched coffee. He was so supportive, so devastated. He told her they would get through it together. He held her while she cried over the ruin of her family. And the whole time he had the money. He had moved on to his next target. His next target was my mother. Tucked into a side pocket of the case was a file labeled Carol. My mother. Eleanor had done her research. She had found out about my father's new life. Inside were copies of public records. My parents' marriage certificate, the deed to the big house I grew up in, purchased just 4 months after his divorce from Eleanor was finalized. It was bought in cash. The cash he had stolen. He hadn't just left Eleanor. He had used the money he'd bled from her family to build a new life, a new history, a new respectable identity. He had literally built my childhood home on the foundations of their ruin. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Every happy memory I had in that house, Christmas mornings, birthday parties, summer barbecues, was now tainted, stained by this horrific truth. My life had been funded by a crime. Did my mother know? I finally asked, the question I was most afraid of. Catherine looked at me, her expression a mixture of pity and steel. "I don't know," she said honestly. At first Ellie was convinced she couldn't have, but then, Richard wasn't the kind of man who could keep a secret if it benefited him to share it. He liked having leverage. My guess? He told her a version of the story, a version where he was the victim, where Eleanor was unstable or unfaithful, and he managed to salvage something from a bad situation. He would have made her feel special, like she was the only one he could trust with his painful past. He would have made her a co-conspirator without her even realizing it. That sounded exactly like him. It sounded like the man I knew, the master manipulator. He wouldn't have just lied. He would have twisted the truth into a weapon and used it to bind my mother to him. The final item in that case was a small, sealed envelope. On the front, in Eleanor's hand, it said, "For the daughter, if you ever find this." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter written not to me by name, but to the idea of me. It was short, and the words were etched onto the page with what must have been a heavy heart. "I don't know who you are, or what he has told you," it read. "But I know he is a man who builds his life on the wreckage of others. I hope, for your sake, that you are part of the life he built, and not the wreckage he leaves behind. Be careful. His love is a cage." The third case was different. It wasn't about the past, it was about the present. It seemed Eleanor had never stopped keeping tabs on my father. She had become a ghost, silently chronicling his life from a distance. The case was filled with newspaper clippings of his business achievements, printouts from his company's website, even programs from charity events he had chaired. He had built a fortress of respectability around himself. But underneath the public accolades, Eleanor had found the cracks. The case contained financial records she had somehow obtained over the years. Private investigation reports. She had spent what little money she had left trying to find a way to expose him, but he had covered his tracks too well. The fire was a cold case, the forgeries too old to prosecute. He had won. But the most shocking discovery was in a folder labeled "The Trust," my trust. The one my grandfather had left me, the one my father managed. Inside was a statement from a private wealth management firm I'd never heard of. It showed the original principal of the trust, a substantial sum. And then it showed a series of investments my father had made on my behalf over the last decade. High-risk, speculative ventures, companies that had gone bankrupt. It was a trail of catastrophic losses. But next to those statements was another set of documents, brokerage accounts in my father's name. And on the exact same days he had invested my trust money in a failing company, he had taken a short position on that same company in his own account. He was using my money to make bad bets, knowing they would fail, while simultaneously betting against them with his own money to make a profit. He wasn't just a bad investor. He was using my inheritance as his personal hedge fund, intentionally tanking my future to guarantee his present. He was stealing from me, from his own daughter. He had done the exact same thing to me that he had done to Eleanor's family, just with more sophisticated tools. The little rock he was so proud of was the one he was hollowing out from the inside. I finally understood the full scope of his monstrosity. He didn't see people, he saw assets. Eleanor's family was an asset to be stripped. My trust was an asset to be liquidated. My compliance was an asset to be exploited. We were all just resources for him to consume on his way to building his perfect life. Catherine put her hand on my arm. He was a parasite, Mia. He attached himself to people with good hearts and resources, and he drained them dry. My sister was the first. It looks like you were meant to be the last. I thought of my mother and Leo, so eagerly awaiting the reading of the will, so confident in the fortune they were about to inherit. I looked at the documents in front of me, proof of fraud, theft, and a mountain of debt my father had hidden behind his successful facade. The portfolio they were so excited to split. It was probably a mirage, a house of cards built with my stolen money and propped up by lies. The king was dead, and I was holding the evidence that his entire kingdom was a fraud. We still had the wooden chest to open. Catherine told me it was Eleanor's personal memento box. We took it back to my apartment, the air thick with unspoken grief for a woman I'd never met but now felt inextricably linked to. Ben was home, and I quickly brought him up to speed, my voice a monotone as I laid out the facts of my father's breathtaking betrayal. He listened, his face hardening with anger on my behalf. He held my hand, his presence a silent promise that I wasn't going through this alone. I used the small brass key on the lock of the wooden chest. It opened with a soft click. The scent of cedar and old paper filled the air. Inside, it was a treasure trove of a lost life. There were photographs of Eleanor and my father from their brief, happy years. Love letters he had written her, filled with poetry and promises of a beautiful future. It was sickening to read them, knowing the lies that underpinned every word. There was a lock of her hair tied with a ribbon, a dried corsage, the small, sentimental artifacts of a love she thought was real. In a way, this was the cruelest discovery of all. The financial documents were evidence of a crime. Chest was evidence of a broken heart. He hadn't just stolen her money, he had stolen her youth, her trust, her very belief in love. He had made her believe in a fairy tale, and then burned the book in front of her. At the bottom of the chest, I found a leather-bound journal. It was Eleanor's diary. The first half was filled with the giddy, joyful entries of a young woman in love. The second half was a chronicle of her slow, agonizing discovery of the truth. I read an entry from the week after the fire. Richard holds me so tight at night. He tells me we'll rebuild. He's my rock. I don't know what I'd do without him. But sometimes, when he thinks I'm asleep, I feel him shake. I thought it was grief, but it feels different. It feels like fear. I read another, months later. The numbers don't add up. The lawyer said the debt is immense. Richard keeps saying we are in debt, but the loans are all connected to the business. He says it's all tied up together. I asked to see the paperwork, and he got so angry. He said I was questioning his integrity. He made me feel so small. Her last entry was dated the day their divorce was finalized. He's gone. He took everything that wasn't nailed down. He told me I was lucky he wasn't suing me for emotional distress. He looked at me with the eyes of a stranger. The man I married is gone. I think maybe he was never there at all. I have to believe that. It's the only way I'll survive. Today, I start over. Today, I become a ghost. I close the journal, my tears falling onto the worn leather cover. She had survived, but she had been forced to become a ghost, haunting the edges of his new life, collecting the proof of his sins. The key she left behind wasn't just a key to a storage unit. It was the key to her story, a story my father had tried to bury forever. And she, through her sister Catherine, had passed it to me. It was a legacy, a responsibility. I knew what I had to do. The time for being the quiet, responsible, accommodating daughter was over. That person was a fiction, as fictional as the man I had called my father. It was time for a reckoning. The next morning was the day of the will reading. The air in the lawyer's office was stale and self-important. I arrived with Ben by my side. I was also carrying a briefcase. Not my purse. A briefcase. It was a deliberate choice, a piece of theatre. It was one of the leather cases from Eleanor's storage unit. Inside were the most critical documents, the cancelled insurance policy, the forged loan applications, and the statements showing my father's systematic draining of my trust fund. My mother and Leo were already there, sitting opposite the lawyer's desk. My mother gave me a watery, disapproving smile. "Mia, darling, you look so severe," she said, eyeing the briefcase. Leo just grunted, looking at his watch. He was ready to get this over with and count his money. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Abernathy, who had been my father's crony for decades, cleared his throat and began. He droned on in legalese, his voice oozing false sympathy. He confirmed what Leo had said, the house to my mother, the personal effects, and the trust to me. And then he got to the main event. "And the remainder of the estate," he said, pausing for dramatic effect. including all stocks, bonds, and the full investment portfolio held by Miller Financial, is to be divided equally between my beloved wife, Carol Miller, and my son, Leo Miller. Leo sat up straighter, a smug, satisfied look on his face. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue. "He was always so generous," she whispered. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment. Then I leaned forward and placed the briefcase on the desk with a solid thud. "There's a problem with that," I said, my voice clear and steady. Mr. Abernathy looked at me over his glasses. "I beg your pardon, Miss Miller." Leo rolled his eyes. "Oh, here we go. Mia, not now." "Now's the only time, Leo," I said, not taking my eyes off the lawyer. I opened the briefcase. "Mr. Abernathy, you were my father's lawyer, so perhaps you can help clarify a few things. For instance, this investment portfolio you're referring to. Is it the same portfolio that was funded in part by my father systematically short-selling stocks using money he was stealing from my trust fund?" I slid the brokerage statements across the desk. Abernathy's face went pale. He picked up the top sheet, his hand visibly shaking. Leo shot out of his chair. "What is this? What are you talking about? That's insane. Is it?" I countered, my voice like ice. "Or is it insane that my father, Richard Miller, the great financial wizard, was also a common thief who built his fortune on the back of a family he destroyed 30 years ago?" I then pulled out the file on Jensen's fine woods, the forged loan documents, the cancelled insurance policy. I laid them out one by one, like a poker hand I knew I couldn't lose. He bankrupted his first wife's family. He may have even been responsible for the fire that ruined them. He stole their money, used it to marry you, Mom, and buy the house you live in. And then, for an encore, he spent the last 10 years stealing from me. The room was utterly silent, except for the frantic rustling of paper as Mr. Abernathy shuffled through the documents I'd provided. His professional composure had evaporated, replaced by the panicked look of a man seeing his own comfortable world about to implode. My father's crimes were one thing, but a lawyer's complicity in hiding them was another. His career was flashing before his eyes. My mother was staring at me, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. "Mia, what are you saying? This is poison. That woman, that horrible woman at the funeral, she got to you. She's filling your head with lies." "Her name was Catherine Jensen," I said calmly. "And her sister, Eleanor, was my father's first wife. These aren't lies, Mom. This is her journal. These are her documents. This is the truth you either didn't know or chose to ignore." I looked directly at her, searching her face for any flicker of recognition, any sign that she knew. "Did you know, Mom? Did you know where the money came from to buy our house? Did you ever wonder why his entire past before he met you was a complete blank?" She just shook her head, tears streaming down her face now, real tears of shock and panic. No. He told me he had a bad divorce. He said she was unstable. He said he had to protect himself." Her voice trailed off as the implications of what she was saying dawned on her. She had believed the story he had crafted just for her, making her the heroine who saved him from the crazy ex-wife. She was a victim too, in her own way. A willing one, perhaps, who enjoyed the fruits of his crime without asking too many questions, but a victim nonetheless. Leo, however, was a different story. He wasn't crying, he was livid. His face was red, a vein throbbing in his temple. "You're destroying this family," he roared, pointing a shaking finger at me. "For what? Some old story? Dad is dead. What is the point of dragging his name through the mud?" "His name?" I laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "His name is worthless, Leo. And so is his portfolio. I've had an independent forensic accountant look at this. The fortune you're inheriting is a fantasy. It's all smoke and mirrors. The business is leveraged to the hilt with secret loans. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul for years. He was robbing me to pay Paul. The man was insolvent. There is no money." The colour drained from Leo's face. The smugness, the arrogance, it all vanished, replaced by a raw, animal panic. It was never about Dad's memory. It was only ever about the money. And I had just told him the vault was empty. "You're lying," he hissed. "You're trying to cut us out. You're trying to take it all for yourself." "There's nothing to take, Leo," I said, standing up. "Don't you get it? It's all gone. The only thing of value he had left was my trust, and he was burning through that pretty fast. I turned to Mr. Abernathy. I have filed a formal complaint against my father's estate for fraud and theft. All assets are to be frozen, pending a full investigation. As the primary creditor since he stole from Memmy claim will be settled first from whatever is left after the mountain of debt is paid, which means, Mom, Leo, you're getting nothing. In fact, you'll be lucky if you get to keep the house. The fallout was swift and brutal. Leo didn't take it well. His denial curdled into a desperate, cornered animal rage. He lunged across the desk, not at me, but at the papers, trying to sweep them onto the floor to make them disappear. "Lies! It's all lies!" he screamed, his voice cracking. Ben, who had been standing silently by the door, moved in an instant, catching Leo's arm before he could do any real damage. "Leo, stop," Ben said, his voice calm but firm, a stark contrast to my brother's hysteria. Mr. Abernathy finally jolted into action, stammered, "This meeting is over. This is a civil matter. I'll have no violence in my office." My mother just sat there, making a strange, high-pitched keening sound, her hands covering her face. She was watching her entire world, the one Richard had built for her, dissolve in front of her. Leo finally sagged, the fight going out of him as the reality of the situation began to penetrate his thick skull. The numbers didn't lie. The documents were real. The golden parachute he'd been expecting his whole life had just been revealed to be a bag of rocks. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful in its honesty. "You always resented us," he spat. "You were always jealous of me and Dad. This is your revenge, isn't it? Burning it all down because you were never his favorite." It was so absurd, so perfectly in character, that I almost laughed. After everything I had just revealed about the kind of man our father was, Leo's only conclusion was that I was jealous. He was incapable of seeing our father as anything other than a prize to be won. "You're right, Leo," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm just devastated that I wasn't the favorite child of a con man, a thief and a sociopath. My life is ruined." I turned my back on him and looked at my mother. Her keening had subsided into silent, shuddering sobs. "The house is heavily mortgaged, Mom," I said, my voice softening slightly. I felt a flicker of pity for her. She was a woman who had built her identity on being Mrs. Richard Miller. Now both Richard and the Miller fortune were exposed as frauds. He took out a second and third mortgage on it years ago. "You won't be able to afford it. You'll have to sell." She looked up at me, her face blotchy and swollen. "Where will I go?" she whispered. "What will I do?" It was the question of a child, not a grown woman. For decades, she had outsourced her life, her security, and her morality to my father. Now that he was gone, she was completely adrift. "I don't know, Mom," I said, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel responsible for finding her the answer. That's not my problem to solve anymore. Ben and I walked out of the office, leaving the wreckage of the Miller family behind us. The air outside felt clean and fresh. I took a deep breath, the first one that didn't feel tight and constricted. It was the breath of a woman who had just been set free. In the weeks that followed, the full picture of my father's financial ruin came into focus. The forensic accountant I hired worked with the estate's lawyers and confirmed everything Eleanor's documents had suggested, and more. My father's successful financial advisory firm was a Ponzi scheme on a small personal scale. He was using new client money to pay off old debts and create the illusion of returns. He had multiple secret credit cards, all maxed out. The man who lectured me about fiscal responsibility had more debt than a small country. The portfolio Leo and my mother were meant to inherit was mostly fiction, a collection of nearly worthless stocks and shell companies that existed only on paper. Once the fraud against my trust was settled, and the mountain of other creditors took their share, there was, as I had predicted, nothing left. In fact, the estate was in the red. Leo was forced to confront the fact that his entire career, which my father had helped him start with a generous loan, was also funded by this stolen money. The business he thought he'd built was just another branch of my father's rotten tree. He had to declare bankruptcy. The humiliation was total. He went from being the town's golden boy to a cautionary tale overnight. He tried to fight it, of course. He hired a lawyer to contest my claim, arguing I was unduly influenced, that the documents were fakes, but the evidence was overwhelming, the paper trail was undeniable. His challenge was laughed out of court. My mother had to sell the house. All the expensive furniture, the art, the symbols of their perfect life, were sold off at an estate sale for pennies on the dollar. She ended up moving into a small, sterile condominium, the kind of place she used to look down on with pity. The community that had once revered her and my father now whispered about them behind her back. She had lost her home, her status, and her history all at once. She called me once, about a month after the will reading. Her voice was small. She didn't yell or accuse me. She just asked, "Why, Mia? Why did you have to dig it all up? We could have been happy not knowing." "Were you happy, Mom?" I asked gently. "Or were you just comfortable? There's a difference." She didn't have an answer. That was the last time we spoke. I didn't do it out of cruelty. I did it out of necessity. They were a part of a life that was based on a lie, and I couldn't live that lie anymore. Cutting them off wasn't just about the money or the betrayal. It was about choosing my own reality. It was about honoring the truth, no matter how ugly it was. It was about honoring Eleanor. I took a portion of the money I recovered from my trust and found Catherine Jensen. I gave it to her. "It's not much," I said, "and it's 30 years too late, but it's what he stole, it's yours." She tried to refuse, but I insisted. "Eleanor left me the key," I told her. "She left me the truth. That's worth more than this. Please, let this be the end of the story. Let her family have the last word." She finally accepted, tears in her eyes. It wasn't just money, it was justice, a small, delayed, but deeply meaningful piece of it. Life after the explosion was quiet, eerily so at first. For years, my phone had been a conduit for my family's needs, a constant source of low-grade anxiety. A call from my mother meant she needed a favor or wanted to complain. A text from Leo was almost always a prelude to him asking for money. A summons from my father was a command to appear and play my role. Now there was silence. No guilt trips, no passive-aggressive comments, no manufactured emergencies. At first, the silence felt like a void. I kept checking my phone, bracing for an incoming call that never came. It was like having a phantom limb. The source of the pain was gone, but I still felt the ache. Ben helped me navigate it. "You've been in fight or flight mode for 28 years, he said one evening as we cooked dinner together, the simple domesticity of it feeling like a radical act of peace. "Your body is still waiting for the next crisis. It's going to take time to learn how to just be." He was right. I had to consciously untangle myself from the patterns of behavior my family had instilled in me. I had to learn that it was okay to put my own needs first, that no was a complete sentence, and that my value as a person was not tied to my utility to others. It was a slow, deliberate process of rebuilding myself from the ground up. I started going to therapeutic therapy, not the kind Leo had suggested to fix me. I talked about my father, not just the monster he was revealed to be, but the confusing, charismatic, manipulative man who had raised me. I grieved the father I thought I had, the one whose approval I had so desperately craved. It was a complicated grief, mourning a man who never really existed. I had to accept that the love I felt for him, and the love I thought he felt for me, was built on a foundation of lies. But the feelings had been real, at least on my end, and I had to make peace with that. I also had to unravel the complex knot of my relationship with my mother and brother. I had to forgive them, not for their sake, but for mine. Forgiving them didn't mean letting them back into my life. It meant letting go of the anger and resentment that was tying me to them. It meant accepting that they were who they were, a weak woman who chose comfort over courage, and an arrogant man who inherited his father's entitlement but not his cunning. They were no longer my problem to solve, my responsibility to carry. They were just two people I used to know. The silence that had once felt like a void slowly began to feel like peace. It was the sound of my own life, waiting to be lived on my own terms. 6 months after the funeral, Ben and I got married. It wasn't a big affair. We went to the courthouse with Catherine Jensen and a few of our close friends as witnesses. There were no lilies, no receiving lines, no performances. It was simple and honest and real. Standing there, holding Ben's hands, I felt a profound sense of rightness. I was choosing my own family, a family based on mutual respect, love, and honesty. After the ceremony, we all went out to a lovely dinner. Catherine raised a glass. "To Eleanor," she said, her eyes shining. "She would have loved to see this. She was a ghost for too long. You finally let her rest." And then she looked at me, and to Mia, who had the courage to turn the key. We drank the toast, and I felt a sense of closure that I never thought possible. Later that night, Ben and I were looking out the window of our hotel room. The city lights twinkled below, a million separate stories all happening at once. "Do you ever think about them?" Ben asked softly. "Your mom and Leo?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "Not with anger anymore, more with a kind of detached sadness. I think about what they lost, not the money, but the chance to live an honest life. They're trapped in the wreckage of my father's lies, and they don't even know how to get out." I had seen my mother a few weeks prior by chance at a grocery store. She looked older, smaller. She was pushing her own cart, carefully examining the price of cereal. She didn't see me, and I didn't approach her. There was nothing left to say. Our relationship had been a casualty of the truth, collateral damage in a war I didn't start but had to finish. My father had planted a quiet bomb in the center of our family, and I was the one who had to detonate it. The explosion was messy and destructive, but it was necessary. It cleared away the lies, the manipulation, the years of quiet suffering. From the rubble, I was finally able to build something new, something that was truly my own. I thought about Eleanor's final journal entry. "Today I become a ghost." She had been forced into the shadows. By exposing my father's secrets, I had inadvertently stepped into the light. I had taken the story he tried to bury and brought it into the sun. It wasn't just my vindication, it was hers too. I had a weird thought. My father, the master of control, had lost control of his own narrative. His carefully curated legacy was in ashes, and the two women he had wronged the most were the ones who ended up writing the final chapter of his story. There was a dark, poetic justice in that which I found deeply, profoundly satisfying. A year has passed since that day in the lawyer's office. The quiet that once felt so strange is now my normal. It's a peaceful, productive quiet. Ben and I bought a small house in a neighborhood where no one knows the name Miller. I started my own graphic design business, something I'd always dreamed of but never had the confidence to pursue. It turns out that when you're not spending all your emotional energy managing a dysfunctional family, you have a lot left over for your own goals. My life is blissfully, wonderfully boring now. It's filled with small, happy things. Waking up next to the man I love, walking our dog in the park, the satisfaction of sending an invoice for a job well done. These are the things my father's drama and my mother's neediness, and my brother's entitlement had crowded out for so long. They were the weeds that were choking the garden. I had to pull them out by the roots. I still have the wooden chest from Eleanor's storage unit. It sits in my office. I don't open it often, but I like knowing it's there. It's a reminder. A reminder that truth is more important than comfort, that secrets are a cancer, and that the past, no matter how deeply you bury it, always finds a way to the surface. I also keep the small brass key. It sits on my desk in a little dish. It's my touchstone. It reminds me of the woman who had the courage to give it to me, and the woman who had the courage to use it. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had listened to my mother and Leo, if I had thrown the key away and accepted the sanitized version of the story. I would have inherited a trust fund that was secretly being drained to nothing. Leo and my mother would have inherited a mountain of debt disguised as a fortune. The lies would have continued, festering under the surface, until the whole rotten structure collapsed on its own, probably in an even more spectacular and damaging way. By forcing the issue, I hadn't destroyed the family. I had simply exposed the fact that it was already destroyed. I just turned on the lights in a house that had been rotting in the dark for decades. My father was a man who built cages. He built one for Eleanor's family out of debt and ruin. He built one for my mother out of lies and comfortable dependency. He built one for Leo out of entitlement and false promises, and he built one for me out of guilt and responsibility. The key didn't just open a padlock on a storage unit, it opened all the cages. They were free to stay in them if they chose. But I was flying out. The most profound change in my life isn't the absence of my old family, but the presence of my new one. It's the family I chose. It's Ben, my anchor and my partner in every sense of the word. It's Catherine, who I have lunch with once a month. We never talk about my father anymore. We talk about books and politics and the funny thing her cat did last week. We are two women from different generations, bonded by a strange and tragic history, who have decided to build a new, happier one together. She has become the aunt I never had. My life is my own now. My victories are my own. My mistakes are my own. I am no longer the responsible one, the peacemaker, the shock absorber. I am just Mia, and it is more than enough. My father's greatest fear was being exposed. He spent his entire life curating an image, building a wall of lies to protect his fragile ego and his fraudulent existence. His legacy is not one of community leadership or financial success. His true legacy is a box of documents in my office and a story of destruction. He wasn't a builder. He was a demolitions expert. He demolished lives, trust, and futures. I've come to realize that my actions weren't an attack on his memory. You can't desecrate something that was never sacred in the first place. My actions were an act of preservation. I was preserving the truth. I was preserving the memory of Eleanor Jensen and her family, and in the end, I was preserving myself. I chose to save myself from being the final victim in a long line of them. I chose my own future over his fabricated past. It was the most selfish and the most selfless thing I have ever done. I am at peace now, a deep, abiding peace that I earned with every hard question, every difficult conversation, and every severed tie. I am no longer a collage of other people's expectations and needs. I am my own person, whole and complete, but I still wonder from time to time about the path I took. I blew up my entire family structure based on a secret handed to me by a stranger. I chose a dead woman's truth over my living family's comfort. So I'll ask you, was what I did an act of justice, or was it a cold, calculated act of revenge? Did I go too far, or not far enough?